let's move now to Distinguished Professor and Director of the Centre for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg. That's Professor Patrick Bond. Prof, thank you. Firstly, while the vote count continues, surely whatever comes out could be cast into doubt, because the EU observer mission, for example, has said, well, nobody has seen the voters' roll. So right there is a check and balance that hasn't been provided.
Yes, that's right. And just by way of disclosure, 23 years ago, I was on that SADC observer mission, and we did come up with similar complaints. They were widespread in some of the areas that were seen to be in favor of the MDC, now called the CCC. Now, the really important precedent might be 2008, because when there was an election in March that the then opposition leader, the late Morgan Tsvangirai, won, then there was so much violence, as you recall, for the June runoff, because Tsvangirai wasn't given the 50% required. And it was at that point that an interesting precedent emerged. So the delegitimization of the electoral process was pretty obvious then. And then the AU, as well as SADC, stepped in and said, we actually aren't going to recognize the Mugabe government. So then the main question is, will there be someone of the stature Thabo Mbeki had in September 2008, who could come in and then by January make sure that the Government of National Unity, which lasted 2009 until 2013. To me, that would be the only way out, and it does require this process of, I think, the delegitimization of ZANU-PF's management of yet another apparently rigged election. If I may be wrong, we could see if it's a democratic outcome, but at the moment it does look like these complaints are quite serious.
And SADC speaking out quite strongly for the first time in years, although you are pointing to a precedent where something had to happen. So what now? What if Emmerson Mnangagwa digs his heels in and says, I'm legitimate, my party is legitimate, but SADC comes out with a final report saying these elections were not free?
Well, and it's on top of the rest of the delegitimization of the Mnangagwa regime, especially the Al Jazeera report on the gold mafia, where the ease of bribing and looting the country, and I've seen in my own research visits since the Al Jazeera report came out, many cases in which mafias, the gold mafia, but there are many mafias in each of the mineral sector. And I think that begins to explain this ennui, this tiredness of the ZANU-PF rule, that the society knows there's a great deal of wealth under the ground. Chinese mining companies are everywhere, but there's very little trickling back, and the currency problems, high inflation, and many of the other crises that are affecting ordinary people, they do know that if they get out of the streets, then the police, like in 2018, might actually kill some of the protesters. That was one of the other precedents, that this is a very forceful government defending its interests. But I think the main thing, look, Emmerson Mnangagwa has been trying to get into the world economy, trying to get rid of the Western sanctions, especially individual sanctions, but also financial sanctions. He's been even trying to get into BRICS. He said, although he wasn't part of the 23 countries and leaders that applied, that's where he'd like to settle himself. But I think at this point, the illegitimacy of this particular election looks pretty clear. I may be wrong, and I hope I'm too pessimistic in that there's a genuine democratic outcome everybody supports, but it doesn't look good at this stage.
Yeah. All right, so effectively, are you saying this time he may not be able to get away with it, or ZANU-PF may not be able to get away with it, if it turns out that the election is rigged? I mean, like you say, there are signs, and many of the observers are heading towards that conclusion already.
Yeah, I mean, the difference between, say, 2008, where President Mbeki was able to intervene in September as the delegitimization of President Mugabe had reached a sufficient peak, the difference is that Nelson Chamisa hasn't necessarily shown, the way Morgan Tsvangirai did in March of 2008, that he really has that majority. There are polls that suggest it, but it's very hard for him to do that because, as you know, the rallies that he tried to hold, some of them were disrupted, and the inability of CCC machinery to monitor, even to put up its own electoral material, it meant that, unlike the strength of the MDC at their peak in 2008, we're not seeing the CCC, and we're not also seeing the international interest. The eyes of the world were certainly on Southern Africa. this week, but they weren't on Zimbabwe on Wednesday. They were here in Sandton because the BRICS and some of the most powerful leaders in the world were here trying to figure out if they could expand and become even more powerful. And next door, nobody really seemed to pay much attention.
And I hope we have time to talk about BRICS, but can you just quickly outline, and you started talking about some of the circumstances on the ground where the mineral wealth is being taken, but the only beneficiaries are perhaps government officials and the mining houses and the countries where they come from. What is day-to-day life like for Zimbabweans, poor Zimbabweans at the moment?
Well, I can only speak on the basis of a brief research trip 3 months ago, but it was very important for me to work with the Center for Natural Resource Governance with their really on-the-ground activists and anti-extractive, advocates who see that the looting of the country is going full speed. And the one interesting hypocrisy is that the government actually does say we don't want to have raw materials being shipped out without being processed. We need beneficiation, and they especially apply that to lithium because they have a hard lithium deposit, the biggest in Africa, about 11 million ounces known in Bikita, about 80k to the east of Mashvinga. And it's in that setting that we could see massive amounts of raw lithium being extracted and put on trucks and just sent right out without any processing, no battery plant that we've always hoped for, a local version of a sort of full integrated solar and sort of storage system. Unfortunately, that clearly indicates that the system in which mineral regulation is meant to stop the looting isn't working, or maybe it's not meant to work properly. And when this was pointed out by my colleague Farai Magu, there was a big scandal in the country. He tweeted and it went viral, and they did briefly shut down the Bikita Sino mines, a Chinese plant. But you could really feel in that setting the desperation, the long queues of workers who were desperate to try to get a little piece of the action at that mine, and they were simply being extracted, the raw materials pushed out, and nothing trickling back.
And of course, Zimbabwe has been talking about de-dollarization as well, hoping to be part of the BRICS. I guess what's needed right now for that country is an alternative in the light of reports that the Zim dollar has all but collapsed and US dollars are very hard to come by.
Well, and yet the most interesting thing, I'm glad you mentioned it, Francis, is that this is a model of how difficult it is to de-dollarize. Tragically, you're right that the local currency, which you really want to have some integrity, has been so denuded, partly through overprinting and the high inflation rate, but also because people just don't trust the Reserve Bank. They even tried a cyber currency and they tried a gold-backed currency, and nothing seems to work. The finance minister, Ntuli Ngube, doesn't have that much credibility. But the main thing is the US dollar is pretty much the only exchangeable item that will allow you to store value and exchange in a country where the monetary system's fallen apart. And we were so disappointed, I think, this week to expect a little bit more from the BRICS, these very powerful economies. But they too couldn't move particularly well. They had a little bit more trade-related currency, local currency proposals, but the BRICS Bank, a little bit more local currency, up to 30%, very, very small fraction. But the overarching sense we have is that if you want to go after the US dollar, which I do think would be a good thing because it's just too powerful and too irresponsibly managed, you need to be really well prepared. And Zimbabwe is one little small reflection of what happens when you try to overreach and your society goes right back to the dollar.
All right, great to chat to you as always. Thank you, Professor Patrick Bond from UJ.